All right, so we're going to talk about two things today. One is the ethics of phase 4 trials. And after that, we'll talk about issues with investigator-initiated studies. So the first question I'm going to ask you, and I'll take you to this website. I want you to, in a short sentence, describe the objective or objectives of phase 4 trials. Drug safety, okay. Drug safety data. All right, in a real world setting. All right. Right, rarer adverse events and also long-term adverse events that were not studied in a shorter clinical trial. All right, have any? Okay, I guess we've exhausted, which is fine. Anyone writing before I take this off? Okay, one more. Post-marketing, real-world data, and side of now. What does this mean? Post-marketing, real-world data. Okay. Well, why don't we? That's a good start. So the next two slides, I'll show examples of phase 4 trials for like COPD, switching from one drug to another, rheumatoid arthritis, compare the efficacy of immunomodulator with or without steroid discontinuation. Here's a slide with some titles of studies that I took from clinicaltrials.gov, and you could see that there's trials with diabetes, obesity, and then we have a lot of trials with cancer, and these trials are quite sophisticated, randomized trials, comparing. Here's one. Where is it? I thought I had it here, but open label trials, adults with clinical heart failure, randomized. Oh, this is interesting. Randomized inactivated influenza, thinking that the vaccine is protective for heart failure. So a lot of different trials for phase 4. So the objectives of phase 4 trials: provide a basis for continued marketing, provide information to amend the package insert in terms of safety and other precautions, provide additional data on safety, which may lead to a safer use of the drug, increase physician-patient experience. So that would fall under the rubric of marketing, post-marketing purpose, pharmacoeconomics, quality of life, pediatric patient extension trials, and then we have what's called seeding studies. Now, what do you think about seeding studies? So we have the seeding studies, and this is probably considered a suspect purpose for phase 4 trials. And in fact, I think if I would have given this talk 10, 15 years ago, and I asked you, what's the purpose of phase 4 trials? Probably all of you would have said post-marketing seeding trials in in which drug companies, the primary intention is to promote the use of the drugs that were recently approved or are under review for approval. Essentially, it's to get the docs to be familiar with the drug, and hopefully they'll keep on prescribing the drug as well. So the characteristics of a seeding trial would include lack of a well-defined objective, broad-based eligibility criteria. In fact, they want as many patients as possible taking the drug and gaining experience with the drug. Recruitment of investigators who are not experts or leading researchers, but frequent prescribers of competing products in the same therapeutic class, disproportionately high investigative fees and payment on a per patient scheme, multiple investigators and multiple sites, with each site recruiting only a few participants, inadequate statistical power and sample size, and open label and non-comparative design without appropriate control group, with little or no trial monitoring. So characteristics of a so-called seeding trial. Now, questions to be asked by an ethics committee in order to realize whether you have before you a seeding trial would include, is the medicine in question very expensive, in which otherwise patients would be reluctant to buy? Is the medicine of the high demand category, where particularly rich people would be tempted to buy for osteoarthritis, psoriasis, neurologic pain, cancer, obesity, anti-aging, osteoporosis? Is the drug developed for commonly prevalent but non-serious disease? And are there some equally effective medicine in the market against which the company may wish to compete using the trial data? And trial-specific aspects that the IRB should look towards is the trial trying to answer a trivial question? Are the objectives and endpoints in synchrony with the stated research questions? Are relatively inexperienced investigators involved in the trial? And then a whole list of other characteristics to look out for to see if this trial is a seeding trial, and probably a waste of resources, human resources, and probably unjustifiable to enter patients in such a study. And this slide shows differences between phase 1, phase 3, and phase 4 trials. Obviously, phase 4 clinical practice, unrestricted patient population, because now you want to see the drug in the whole population. Sample size, high sample size, practice-oriented, flexible, cognitive therapy are allowed, less rigid design, and the sponsor's goal is marketing advantage, but as most of you have said, the major purpose is to get additional safety medicine, safety data, but also the other purpose, there's two terms we usually use, efficacy versus effectiveness. If I were to say, in a clinical trial, we look for efficacy of the drug, and then when we go in the real world and test it on everyone, we look for effectiveness. What's the difference?
Well, the efficacy shows the sort of the best case, under strict conditions, sort of best case scenario, what treatment effects you can observe. If you get high compliance and you've got a selected group of patients, I guess the effectiveness is a more conservative estimate of the treatment effect in a patient group that probably more closely represents the population and includes things such over a longer time period. I'm not sure.
You said a lot of key points. In a drug trial, you want to see if the drug works and on a certain patient population. That's why we have exclusion criteria. And you mentioned the word compliance, which is very high in drug trials because we monitor the patients very carefully, make sure they take the drug. However, in the real world, compliance may be low because of side effects. They stop taking the drug. And also, it involves an unrestricted patient population, so we don't have those exclusion criteria anymore. So the effectiveness may be quite low with some drugs, especially with side effects, compliance, and also now we're testing it in patients who were excluded in the original trial. So phase 4 studies also looks for, in addition to safety, also to effectiveness of the drug. Now, regarding safety, this study, 2017, nearly 1 in 3 recent FDA drug approvals followed by major safety actions. About a third of the drugs that were approved by the FDA and you followed in phase 4 trials had some major safety issues. And this was reported in the JAMA article. Now, most of the safety concerns were not serious enough to require withdrawal of all these drugs from the market, but the finding highlights the need for ongoing monitoring of these drugs in the post-marketing period. It took a median of 4.2 years after the drugs were approved for the safety concerns to surface. This was more common among the psychiatric drugs, biologic drugs, and drugs that were granted accelerated approval. That's why we have that concern also with the vaccines. And they want to make sure, even though the vaccines were shown to be effective several weeks ago, they wanted 60 days of safety data. Now, regarding, the safety concerns are popping up more frequently because the drugs, there's been a shift in perspective. More drugs are going through an accelerated approval process than 20 years ago. And also, the approvals typically rely on surrogate endpoints. And hence, surrogate endpoints only indirectly indicate the efficacy of these drugs. And again, in the post-marketing period, where now you're looking at the ultimate endpoints, it may not show to be as effective as you thought it might be. So essentially, the shift in emphasis represents a balancing act, an ethical balancing act between two values. One value is that you want faster approval in order to make the drugs available to patients, whereas that is in tension with a safety factor. So this balancing act has the desire to treat the illness versus drug safety. And essentially, that's what we're seeing now with the vaccines, because there is a huge desire for a vaccine, even though they are taking precautions for drug safety. But think about this, 60 days worth of safety data. Now, when they pushed forth the vaccine for, I think it was the swine flu 10, 12 years ago, it had a lot of safety concerns. I'm sorry, it was for an influenza strain. And they pushed through the vaccine, had a lot of safety concerns, and the influenza strain did not prove to be very extensive in terms of morbidity and mortality. So essentially, there is what we call a life cycle concept with approval of drugs. So here we have the clinical evaluation of the drug, and then the drug enters the market, and then throughout the whole life cycle of the drug, we should always be monitoring for safety and effectiveness. And if we see a drug with a lot of safety concerns, it's removed from the market. Now, again, in the last 10, 20 years, this drug approval process has gotten shifted more towards the left in order for the drugs to enter the market a lot sooner, which with this shift in emphasis, it makes phase 4 studies even more important. So the objective of phase 4 trials is to determine the behavior of the drug when used in real life situation without the restrictions that were common in the pre-marketing clinical trials, meaning the exclusion criteria, restriction on concomitant meds, restriction on dose. You couldn't have the opportunity to see the rare adverse effects. Now you want to observe the chronic adverse effects. You want to see how the drug works in new populations and compared with older drugs as well. That's where the investigator-initiated studies come in. Now you have approved drugs that now you could study in the real world as well. Now, in terms of design, phase 4 design, it could consist of a non-intervention trial or observation trial. It could be an intervention trial, comparing two drugs, having patients randomized in a phase 4 trial, or it could be a retrospective trial. Again, phase 4 trials, it could be a randomized controlled trial. It could be practice-based clinical experience or a non-intervention observation trial. It could be an intervention observation trial. It could be what's called a large simple trial, or it could be a post-marketing surveillance study looking at effectiveness, drug utilization, and pharmacoeconomic studies as well. So who usually initiates phase 4 studies? Well, it could be the regulatory agency who wants to have a robust phase 4 trial because either in the pre-marketing study, there was some kind of a signal indicating a potential risk related to the use of the drug, but they approved the drug anyway, thinking that they would do this follow-up phase 4 study, or there could be a post-marketing signal indicating a serious risk to the drug. It could be initiated by the drug company to support other aspects or other effects of the drug in other populations. Or it could be investigator-initiated trials, usually comparing two approved drugs or other types of physician-initiated drug trials. Interventional phase 4 trials. I took some slides from quintiles. I have no conflict of interest with quintiles. So it could be interventional, meaning randomized trials. Again, looking at different drugs. It could be non-interventional phase 4 trial or prospective observational cohort studies or patient registries. These are non-randomized, non-interventional trials, or retrospective trials using retrospective data, essentially looking at databases, epidemiologic data used to see the effects of the drug from retrospective data. And the large simple trial is essentially you give the drug to an unrestricted patient population with no essentially broad inclusion exclusion criteria and minimal site monitoring and you continue with the follow-up even after treatment has stopped. Now, I want to go over what's called the ethics of drug safety research. And when I bring that up, I'm talking mainly about what type of trial design do you use when you do phase 4 trials? Because not all, as you can see from the previous slides, not all trials, phase 4 trials, are going to be retrospective or observational. Sometimes you do want to have the randomized controlled trial. So let me go over one study called the TIDE study. How many people here have heard of the TIDE study? That was done about 10 years ago. Oh, all right, good. By the way, I forgot to request that people put on their videos as much as possible, because that gives me feedback. Okay, so the TIDE study, involved this drug, can't pronounce the name, with vitamin D to compare the cardiovascular outcomes of long-term treatment with this drug compared with this drug. Now, these two drugs were used for patients with diabetes. A concern with drug treatment of diabetes is the cardiovascular effects of these drugs in the diabetic patient. And the concern mainly with this drug here was that in 2008, the FDA ordered GlaxoSmithKline, the manufacturer of this drug, to conduct a trial in response to post-marketing meta-analysis showing that that drug had a higher risk of myocardial infarction and death from cardiovascular causes. So they were concerned about the side effects, okay? And they wanted to do let me go back here. They wanted a randomized controlled trial between these two drugs. And they had this meta-analysis showing a safety concern with this drug. So they wanted to do a gold standard randomized clinical trial. And so now, before the trial began, some people argued that there was enough evidence already of the inferior safety of this drug, and hence they thought having a randomized controlled trial comparing that drug with another drug in the same class was unethical. In fact, two FDA epidemiologists wrote that a head-to-head trial would be unethical and exploitative, and that even a robust, informed consent process could not overcome the problem. So what do you think about that? I guess, what do you think about doing a randomized controlled trial?
These both drugs are in the market?
Yes, they were both approved. And the meta-analysis was based on post-marketing studies.
There were so many side effects with the rosiglitazone.
You know how to pronounce that drug. Thank you very much. So, right. Go ahead, continue. There were so many side effects.
Yes, so many patients had the side effects of this medication, so that's why it's unethical.
Okay.
I mean, using a drug that is known to have serious side effects or have been, especially cardiovascular, like you mentioned with diabetes. So in that case, why would they do a randomized controlled trial to use this medication, which might cause harm to patients? More harm than benefit.
But it's still in the market, right? So they want to do a comparison to maybe to withdraw it from the market if we have negative results?
Well, if the trial supports the previous meta-analysis, it would be withdrawn. Or they would change the labeling.
Yeah.
Now, isn't the randomized control trial the gold standard? Do we withdraw the drug from the market based on meta-analysis?
They continue submitting the safety information. They must continue submitting the drug information, safety information, rather stopping the trial.
Well, or not start the trial. Not start the trial, but they wanted more information, better information. Now, having said that, I mean, to be sure, what would you put in the informed consent form? What would you tell the patients the purpose of the study? What is the purpose of the study? What would you tell patients in the informed consent form? We are enrolling you in the study to prove whether the drug is harmful.
Would people sign that?
What's that?
Would people sign that consent form if you're gonna say the drug is gonna be harmful to you?
Well, that's what we're trying to prove, right? We're not trying to prove the effectiveness of the drug.
Trying to fix the side effects.
But we're trying to see if it's harmful, right? If you want to be honest, right? That's what you would say. And hence, they were concerned about the informed consent form as well. Well, they started the the FDA didn't. That was not the general position of the FDA. They thought that there was enough uncertainty about the cardiovascular risks associated with the drug, as well as with the competing drug. And hence, they essentially thought there was clinical equipoise between the two drugs. And if you have clinical equipoise, then if there's enough genuine uncertainty in the community of physicians, then that's sufficient to justify a trial. And now, having said all that, there was a lot of pushback, and also pushback from the U.S. Congress as well. And they essentially finally stopped the trial. They stopped the trial and placed new restrictions on the availability of the drug. And they finally thought the trial was just unethical to continue. So this study raised a lot of questions about the standard of evidence about drug risk, which would justify a decision by the FDA to do a post-marketing research study, particularly a randomized controlled trial. Questions about what ethical obligations the FDA have to patients who participate in these studies. And finally, it highlighted a potential FDA role in ensuring that IRBs are completely informed in their efforts to research participants. And they also, other lessons from the trial raised awareness in the approach to the oversight of drug safety, or raise awareness about the ethics of post-marketing research looking at safety and what kind of trial design would be ethically appropriate. Now, having said that, even after the study was stopped, some people were still writing in the published literature that stopping the trial represented a lost opportunity because other investigators wrote that the available data clearly supported the position of clinical equipoise and thought that by stopping the trial, we would never know for sure with certainty or more certainty about the side effects of the drug in question. So essentially, now we're balancing how much certainty do we need to take a drug off the market or put more marketing restrictions on the drug, and essentially, do we, in our effort to have more certainty, what do we do with the potential risk to study participants? So after that trial was stopped, the FDA, there was a recommendation to have the Institute of Medicine develop a report on the ethical considerations of studying drug safety. And they essentially said they brought up specific ethical issues. What are the informed consent issues in phase 4 studies, especially with RCTs, and whether alternative trial designs should be used instead of RCTs, looking at the drug safety, looking at other approaches to include observational studies, patient registries, meta-analysis, and instead of randomized controlled trials. I mean, do you have to have a gold standard? And so essentially, what types of follow-up studies are appropriate to investigate different kinds of signals, either detected pre-approval or in the post-approval stage? And under what circumstances should we use a head-to-head randomized clinical trials looking for safety? Now, regarding the informed consent, they looked at the informed consent form used in the TIDE trial, and looking at the purpose of the research, they concluded it did not clearly explain that the purpose of the study was to definitively establish that the drug involved a significant higher risk of serious harms compared with the other drug. Concerning the risk, did not convey in the consent form that the FDA was concerned primarily about the safety of the drug and was requiring the sponsor to do the study to definitively conclude whether the drug was harmful. And that was all essentially de-emphasized in the informed consent form. And did not disclose that the current clinical standard of care had moved away from prescribing that drug. So docs were already moving away from prescribing that drug. And if that was indeed the case, one has to question whether there was clinical equipoise in that study. Mechanism for strengthening the informed consent form, clear explanation of why a new study is now required concerning the risk, essentially a balanced summary of the existing evidence about the safety of the drug, explain why experts deem it's reasonable to ask patients to participate in the study, but again, give the reason why the study is being done. So after the study was stopped, and after the Institute of Medicine offered its report, the FDA issued draft guidance in 2008 that required large cardiovascular outcome trials for all new diabetes drugs because of the interaction between these drugs and heart failure, and the fact that most patients with diabetes have underlying heart disease. And so they were requiring these large trials, again, randomized controlled trials, but they didn't have any post-marketing data that there was something wrong with the drug, but they wanted to be preemptive, looking at the side effects in a randomized controlled trial before the safety concerns would surface in the post-marketing period. So they wanted to be proactive in looking at side effects of these drugs because these side effects would not surface in the pre-approval clinical trials. Now, 7 years after this guidance, this paper was published, and they looked at these large cardiovascular outcome trials, looking at whether these trials were worth it in looking at uncovering side effects. And their conclusion was that these large trials was essentially not worth it, especially with the cost, because these trials would randomize thousands of patients and would be very costly to do, and they weren't really seeing much results. And hence, their recommendation was to use observational data to complement or replace these large randomized trials. They had a sentence in their paper, in an era of increasingly sophisticated data analytics, it should be possible to take advantage of large registries to gain information about the safety of new medications. Robust post-marketing surveillance could provide more applicable real-world information than a trial in a select group of patients. So they were advocating, even when you want to be proactive, they were advocating observational study or surveillance study. So my question to you is, if you're going to do these observational surveillance study, do you need informed consent to use the data? Are we involving human subjects? Or are we using human subjects, but a waiver of consent would be appropriate? Or is this considered not research, but a public health surveillance activity? Which one do you think is most applicable? It's not involving human subjects, or a waiver of consent would be appropriate, or it's not research. It doesn't you're collecting data systematically, but it doesn't lead to generalizable information.
We had similar cases, but there was no consent involved in these because they were like registries or sometimes insurance data. Like we had one drug company using insurance data to I can't remember. Maybe you can remember. There was a study using insurance data. It was about one of the medications as well. So there was no informed consent involved. And
so how did you justify? I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just
because
to know
data
justified it.
So it's like a secondary use of data.
Surveillance activities.
I'm sorry?
Surveillance activities, is it?
So
I would say all the three. I would say all don't need informed consent.
No, I'm saying these are all possible reasons why you would not get informed consent.
Okay, fine. And you want to know why?
Okay.
I want to know which one of these reasons would you choose to justify not getting informed consent?
I would choose the first and the last.
No, just all you have to do is choose one.
Choose one. I will choose the first.
The first. And why is that? Why is this not human subject research? Actually, this slide provides a good summary of a lot of things we have discussed in the last 6 weeks.
Because it's not involving human subject in the first one. At least I am sure of this.
No. Why is it not a human subject? What's the definition of a human subject? A human subject is when you either collect data through an intervention or an interaction or retrospectively, you're obtaining identifiable private information.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Okay, so
The definition. Yeah.
now, if you're looking at registries or insurance data, if you're getting the data de-identified, then I agree. This would be applicable. But when you're going into the registries, the data is usually identified, unless the insurance company is giving you the data de-identified. Okay, so it depends on the process. Now, if you get de-identified information, now you're not getting data through an intervention or an interaction. Even in an observation study, someone else is interacting and getting the data for you, and hence, now the question is, even if you're getting de-identified, even if you're getting identified data, it may qualify for a waiver of consent because it's minimal risk and it would be impracticable to do the study with informed consent. So that could be applicable as well. Now, having said all that, one could say that this is a study being done to ensure the safety of public health, and it qualifies as a surveillance activity, and it's not research. And one could make an argument that it's not generalizable data because it's not investigating real-world phenomenon. You're just looking at data for one drug. And the data you get for one drug is not generalizable to other drugs, obviously. So it really depends on your definition of generalizable. There is, when they made changes in the US regulations in the last couple of years, there's had always been this concern about whether public health activity is research or not, and whether it needs to be reviewed by an IRB. And in the new regulations, it says very clearly, public health surveillance activities is not research, and you don't need informed consent. Now, having said that, some types of public health activities could be considered research, but if you're doing it for surveillance purposes, it's not research, and you don't need informed consent. So when you do these large observational studies looking at drug safety, you don't need informed consent, which I think somewhat circles us back to last week's presentation about big data regarding we have this incredible ability to generate a lot of data coupled with this incredible ability to analyze the data. And we have to rethink the issue about getting informed consent for all these studies using big data, which could enhance tremendously the health of populations. Now, I don't want you to go around saying Dr. Silverman is saying you don't need informed consent anymore, okay? That's not what I'm saying. But I'm just saying that with this propensity to analyze big data sets and to avoid the issue of consent bias that may tip the balance in not getting informed consent. And actually, when you ask the public how they feel about the lack of informed consent in these types of studies that has a tremendous ability to advance the health of populations, a large majority of the public is saying, do the study, you don't need my informed consent. So it's an interesting phenomenon when you think about the tension or proposed tension between informed consent and the common good. Be that as it may, depending on how you get the data, it could very well be all three of these do apply. But I think the major one is that this is surveillance activity. It's not research, and you don't need research-informed consent. Let me also circle back to the issue we talked about last week about learning healthcare institutions and doing large pragmatic trials, looking at a comparison of two approved drugs and finding out which one is better. So with that, I find the TIDE study experience one of the most interesting experience in terms of the ethics of safety of trials being done in the post-marketing period. So, any questions?
What about, for example, diabetes prevalence?
I'm sorry?
What about, for example, diabetes prevalence studies?
Which studies? I'm sorry.
Diabetes prevalence.
The one we were just talking about?
No, the one you talk about surveillance, I'm talking about prevalence. The same?
Prevalence.
Prevalence.
Prevalence of diabetes.
For example.
Well, give me more information about this.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't need also consent?
If you're looking for the prevalence of diabetes
in a country.
Oh, well, let's see now. You're getting. I think my short answer would be no. Depending on, again, a combination of things, whether you're collecting names and whether, well, which one of these three are we looking at? So I think that one could say it's a surveillance activity. One could say it qualifies for waiver of consent, or it doesn't involve human subjects. So, and let me also say that in the beginning of the AIDS story, it was very important to collect prevalence information regarding HIV. And in the beginning, there was the concept of HIV exceptionalism, that one needed informed consent because of the concern of stigma and social risks with collecting surveillance data, even with names, because you wanted to follow the course. And in the US, some states did not do prevalence studies. They did prevalence studies, but with informed consent. Other states did not get informed consent. To make a long story a little bit longer, eventually it was decided that if you have robust data security, you could do these studies without informed consent, because you needed good data in order to stop this epidemic or lessen the epidemic of HIV. So that's how I would answer your question. It's another good topic would be the use of data registries, and there's a lot of regulatory narratives on how to do data registries and whether that activity involves human subjects or a waiver of consent, or whether it's merely a surveillance activity. So I appreciate that question.
Thank you.
Okay, good. So I think we'll be seeing a lot of similar activities involving big data, and I think these three considerations should be on your radar on whether you want to get informed consent or not. When those studies are approached. Again, the tension between informed consent / autonomy / privacy and the common good is a tension that will not go away. And we have to be prepared. Okay, good. Years ago, I would never think phase 4 trials would be so interesting to talk about. But there you have it. Now, having said that, we'll talk about another interesting topic. We'll talk about investigator-initiated studies. Now, having said that, what are your concerns with investigator-initiated studies? Why are you asking me to discuss this topic? So you have to tell me, what are your concerns? So go to Menti, menti.com and use the code 9971984. Tell me your concerns. Protocol for study design, protocol design, and funding. Okay, I like these responses. So when you say funding, are you concerning where the funding is coming from or lack of funding?
Lack of funding.
Okay, all right. Okay, good. Drugs could be, well, so the drugs are being used off-label, but now that it's a good thing if you study it. I mean, the concern is when you use it off-label and you're not studying it. So now an investigator may say, hey, listen, I've been using this drug off-label. Now I want to study it.
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity and also a potential threat. I mean, looking at the sort of COVID-19, there have been investigator-led studies using drugs to manage or treat COVID patients with no real preliminary evidence or biological, a strong reason to do so.
Right. Okay. Good. Well said. That's a good point. In fact, this is like really completing the circle. In our first discussion, we talked about research in public health emergencies, and I gave you a list of studies from clinicaltrials.gov regarding, right, all the studies being done, and it looks like people were taking drugs from here and there, and as you said, without a rational basis as to why you're using that drug except to do a study. In fact, actually, I'm sorry I didn't have this idea before, but I should look back at that list I gave you, right? We were commenting on inadequate sample size, inadequate surrogate endpoints, and not the use of a randomized controlled trial. And I'm willing to say that most of those studies on that list was probably investigated and initiated, right? So we're really circling back. Study objectives, study design, benefit of the outcomes. Okay, all right, good. So why? Hey, isn't this amazing? Investigators, I mean, aren't they trained in how to do good research? Okay, that's a good list. Where is the let me bring up. There it is. All right, so let's talk about investigator-initiated clinical trials in human subjects. Oh, here's the progression. We're going to look at the rewards, responsibilities, and risk, and implications for IRB review. All right, So, well, investigator-initiated studies are studies initiated by investigators. The major difference from non-investigator-initiated study is that the investigator is now taking on the role of the sponsor. It's taking on responsibilities and now complying with the regulations where before the drug companies had to comply with the regulations. The idea is largely initiated outside of pharma. However, the drug companies are interested in providing support for development and conduct of the project. These studies are either called investigator-initiated research studies or trials. Okay, so we already answered that question. Very good. So this was back in 2003. So essentially, these studies do generate data on effectiveness and safety in the real world setting. Okay, so they're similar. Most of them are like phase 4 studies. And these studies do change how we practice medicine, just like this study here, looking at the reduction in cardiovascular events with this drug in more than 2,000 patients with type 2 diabetes. And so now, after that study, after actually a 5 to 8 year decline in investigator-initiated studies, they have gained renewed interest as more and more drug companies are using them as a creative and cost-effective way to innovate and further improve patient safety. And essentially, I think it's on the next slide. Oh, well, yeah, I should have, no. Well, I have a slide that shows that the drug companies in the last few years are promoting investigator-initiated studies on their website. They really encourage it. They are willing to provide funding and also help with development of the protocol, but they don't want any regulatory role in the study. And in fact, some drug companies, 20 to 30% of their portfolio involves investigator-initiated studies. So why do we need these studies? Well, again, advanced science fulfill gaps in knowledge, new indications for approved drug, real-world studies. Investigators have better access to information. They understand what needs to be done to get a project submitted and approved. Cost-effective way to advance research, and also you could do population-based investigator-initiated studies. Again, the purpose, explore further uses of marketed drugs for new indications, in new populations, in new dosage regimens, or in new combinations with other treatments, primarily in patients with cancer. Evaluate biomarkers that could be useful in management, redefine safety, effectiveness, information, foster scientific exchange and collaboration, and demonstrate that companies' willingness to expose its marketing claims to third-party research. Again, the benefits: real-world setting, learning tool for the site staff, help in repurchasing of licensed drugs, generates more safety data, aids in the producing generalizability of the drug to other populations. So a lot of, let me skip that slide. So essentially, the questions that generally arise, investigators are driven by questions that generally arise after you've done the phase 1 to phase 3 study. So essentially, these are studies that are essentially phase 4 studies. So a clinician may use an already licensed drug or approved drug for a different therapeutic indication. So it's that if you're using the drug off label, again, what I said before, you would want to now do a study to collect data to see if your hypothesis is true. But I accept what Tom said, that sometimes you're using the drug mainly just to do a study, and your hypothesis that this study may work in this new disease entity may not have any firm grounding. Comparison of 2 different treatment options, and also doing cost effectiveness studies as well. Example of studies are shown in this slide, looking pilot study of mouthwash for prevention of chemotherapy-induced mucositis, phase 1-2 study of these drugs for cancer. Again, a lot of investigator-initiated studies for cancer. And this slide here shows some titles of studies that I took from clinicaltrials.gov. Again, a lot of these studies are looking at cancer. Here's a COVID-19 patients conducting an initial small control clinical trial proof of concept using a biologic drug. I think you guys have given me an idea to look at the database on clinicaltrials.gov and actually publish a paper on investigator-initiated studies in the COVID period. So, good idea. So why do investigators want to do these studies? Flexibility in design, looking at real-world evidence, no intervention from industry except for the funding. It's essentially investigators are tired of getting already written protocols from drug companies in which they have really have had no voice in the design of the protocol. Again, from the investigator's viewpoint, promote innovative thinking, expansion of medical knowledge for already approved drugs, less resource intensity for industry, and when partnered with industry, means to fund research programs. So in terms of funding, for sure from the industry, but one could also get funding from the institution, sometimes meager funding. I did a few months ago funding from my institution. I got funding to do a focus group study involving nurses regarding their experience with moral distress in caring for COVID-19 patients. So that was an investigator-initiated study. Funding from cooperative groups, mainly oncology, and also nonprofit organizations, which funding from nonprofit mitigates conflict of interest concerns. Pharmaceutical company, as I said before, provides financial support, protocol development, assistance, provision of the product, and as I said before, spending on investigator-initiated studies has increased by 20% in the last few years. Again, with these, with the drug company, there's no formal responsibility, low cost, and they don't have to deal with the regulators. And however, depending on the contract they sign with the investigator, they get data ownership and access. Now, I think most of the times the intellectual property rights belongs to the investigator. Again, it all depends on what's written in the contract, but for sure in the contract, they want to have, if not ownership, access to the data. Now, the major risk, as we'll keep on talking about with the investigator-initiated studies, if they are not done properly, the major risk regarding the data is that the data are not good, because the investigators are not good at collecting robust data, collecting data on time, and making sure that the data they're collecting are really supported by the source documents. Now, again, a growing concern, the Office of the Inspector General wants to make sure the activity is legitimate and not just a pretext to expand a product's market. They're concerned that the research professionals are managing the risk. Now, years ago, 2003, the concern that these industry-sponsored clinical trials are filled with conflict of interest, and that the trials are more likely done to reach a conclusion that favors the industry perspective. Back then, the concern was that the negative studies were were not being published. So considerations of these studies: who are the parties? What are the roles? How do you manage the risks of investigator-initiated research? What's the criteria for an appropriate investigator-initiated research? And how should this research be reviewed by the IRB? So, ambiguous roles and responsibility. Who's the investigator? Who's the sponsor? And what do we mean investigator sponsor? So if you look at a Form 1571 in Field 1, it says, who's the sponsor? The sponsor is the person who takes the responsibility for and initiates a clinical investigation. It may be an individual, a company, government agency, academic institution, private organization, or other organization. A sponsor investigator is an individual who both initiates and conducts a clinical investigation and under whose immediate direction the investigational drug is being administered or dispensed. For administrative reason, only one individual should be designated as a sponsor. If a pharmaceutical company will be supplying the drug, but will not itself be submitting the IND, the company is not considered the sponsor. So challenges of the study: in the pre-protocol development phase, the challenges is that the investigator has not done a robust literature search while formulating a research question. Actually, this brings up an example would be the several years ago, there was this Hexa, trying to think of the name of the drug. There was this hexamonium study looking at the mechanism of asthma in healthy volunteers. And it was an old antihypertensive drug. And unfortunately, the third patient died from getting a respiratory illness from the drug. And that study, that was the Ellen Roche study, ROCHE. And one of the concerns in that was an investigator-initiated study. And one of the concerns was that the investigator did not do a proper literature search looking at the side effects of this drug. The other concern with that study was that the IRB did not evaluate that investigator-initiated study adequately enough, and the Office of Human Research Protection shut down Hopkins from doing research until they reorganize their IRBs. And that would be a very good example of an investigator-initiated study that went terribly wrong. Other challenges of these type of studies: failure to hypothesize novel research questions, lack of awareness about recent changes in regulatory guidelines, inadequate training to address ethical issues in clinical research, inadequate workforce at the study site, non-availability of SOPs at the study site, inadequate time for clinicians who are doing these studies, inadequate training to identify and report adverse events or serious adverse events, and non-availability of dedicated clinical research associates.
At DJ, we face all these challenges actually. When we review proposals for IRB, most of these challenges, with many of the studies, we face all these challenges are there.
Okay. You uncover all these challenges when the investigators. Okay, good. Doing the protocol development phase, challenges, formulating research question without confirming feasibility, inadequate sample size, the budget is not adequate, inadequate attention to risk mitigation, and lack of oversight and inadequate team management. During the study phase, non-availability of an internal monitor. The late submission of assays, bioassays, and failure to update the registered study in the clinical trials registry at periodic intervals. Most common violations: failure to follow the protocol, discrepancies between the source documents and the CRS, inadequate drug device accountability, enrolling in ineligible patients, failure to report SAEs, failure to list all the investigators on the 1572, failure to monitor the study, that's repeated, enrollment exceeding the numbers approved by the IRB, no safety assessments, violated a clinical hold, and use of the drug before an IND or an IDE submission. I guess it would be interesting to look at the continuing reports that investigators are supposed to submit. You guys require continuing reports from investigators? Do you have that with your IRBs?
Normally, annual progress reports. Meda?
Yes, it's just an annual progress report.
Right, annual progress reports. So it would be probably interesting to compare the yearly progress report between investigator-initiated studies and drug companies. That's probably a good idea for a study, and you have all the data. Other major challenges with the informed consent, a gap in the understanding of the ethical requirements of research, PIs unaware of the need to have informed consent from the patients, and regulatory approval before they start conducting the study, a risk with the quality of the data as well. Main other ethical challenges: failure to comply with the reporting to the IRB, protocol deviations, SAEs, I mentioned that before, higher risk of a therapeutic misconception, and that the patients would not be understanding that they're participating in research, because now the investigator, right, even more so than before, is serving the dual role of the investigator and and the clinician. So problem with the informed consent. So if you compare industry-sponsored versus investigator-initiated, industry-sponsored, well-organized, structured SOPs and processes in place, experienced team, and a budget, right? You know, when a drug company takes on and investigate at a site, they do their due diligence. And when enrolling in, when accepting an investigator at a study site, and they monitor that investigator, and you know, if an investigator when their research associates come out to look at the CRFs, and if those CRFs are not well prepared, they'll drop the investigator from the study. Now, investigator initiated, somewhat structured, SOPs not available, less experience, and a low budget. Potential risk perspective from industry, really ineffective use of resources. In fact, because the funding doesn't finance the project well, lack of upfront planning, and again, major problem with the data, non-validated data, because they don't come out with their monitors to make sure that the data in the CRFs matches the source document. And legal issues from non-compliance because of the investigator. Now, for sure, industry collaboration has its advantages, but it has all the risks involved that we mentioned. From the institution investigator, well, we mentioned all the potential risks, inadequate resources to act as the sponsor, resources meaning time and personnel, data that may not have been validated, concern with subject safety, legal issues, some non-compliance of regulation, and lack of indemnification of the site from the funding site. And then risk from the subject point of view is that they're not being monitored carefully enough for the side effects. Regulatory considerations, do you have concerns with the IND submission process with the investigator-initiated studies on whether the IND has been properly filled out and submitted to the FDA? Do you have those concerns? I'm assuming you have the same process in the UAE with your FDA type regulatory body in the filing of IND, because as I mentioned before, the drug company is not filing the IND. It's the investigator. And you as an IRB needs to make sure that's right, that's been filed. Has that been a problem, or do you have another process?
We normally don't have the investigator-initiated studies who can do IND submission, to be very frank.
Well, but who files the IND?
These are mostly the pharma-sponsored studies, but as an investigator-initiated studies in Emirates of Dubai, We don't have IND submission as investigator-initiated studies. Please correct me if I'm wrong, please.
So, wait a minute.
Most of our studies are sponsored. We rarely get a non-sponsored study. So usually the pharma, they're the ones who submit it.
You do have investigator-initiated studies, right?
Yes, but not involving medications always.
Oh,
There's a pharmaceutical involvement in the studies.
Well, I guess I'm asking, whose responsibility is it to file the IND? Okay, because the IND, it needs to be filed even for an already approved drug, right?
Yes.
If it's support of a new indication, support a significant change in the advertising of the drug, or is supporting a new route of administration. So
I think with the COVID, we started getting investigator-initiated studies with medications. But before the COVID, we didn't have. Mostly it was pharmaceutical-sponsored studies. I think.
Okay, so you're bringing up a good point. So now with the COVID,
Yes.
okay, and as Tom has said before, right, you're getting all these investigators using all these already approved drugs, right, for new indications, right, COVID. And so someone needs to be filing the IND.
Yes.
So, that's an important issue with your regulatory body, whether these studies, which has no involvement from the drug company, someone has to be filing the IND. Just something to think about. Well, these are all the forms you need for the IND, and then with the investigational device exemption, the major issue there is deciding whether the device is a significant risk or a non-significant risk. And it's the, what I was going to say, yes, who decides whether significant risk or non-significant risk? Well, if the FDA has not made the risk determination, the IRB needs to make that. Usually it's the IRB who makes that determination whether the device is significant risk or not. Well, let me skip that in terms of the, so in terms of IRB reviews, the origin matters. Meeting the challenges of these studies starts with consideration of the origin, essentially who's funding the study. And as you mentioned before, when I started this, the concern is that these studies are being underfunded. Who's funding it? Okay. And what's the setting? Community hospital, physician practice, and even well-funded studies may be deficient because the industry is taking an arm's length relationship, and you may not be well supported with non-monetary resources like statistical expertise, regulatory specialists. When I used to do clinical trials in the ICU, I used to do a lot of sepsis research, okay? And when I would look for a study nurse or a research associate to do my studies, I wanted someone who was well trained with the regulatory aspect.